My name is Lina Yassin, and I'm currently based in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. I work as a programs manager at Climate Tracker, which is an international organization that empowers young people to better communicate climate change in their countries. My interest in climate change started when I was 14. That was in the year of 2013. That year, Sudan has experienced massive flash floods that impacted my city, and I volunteered in a youth-led initiative where we helped the victims of the floods. It's called Nafir, which is a Sudanese word that says getting together and helping others. I am the youngest Sudanese journalist to publish on climate topics, and I think I'm among the very few actually who even publish climate change in Sudan. Sudan has always suffered from serious impacts related to climate change. Last September, Sudan was hit by one of the most massive floods in its history. Sudan is a very poor country, so we don't even have enough resources or even proper infrastructure to deal with the impacts of those floods. And sadly, a lot of people will stay impacted by those floods for several years. And also heat waves. A lot of studies recently have showed that Sudan, among other countries in North Africa, are going to experience very hot temperatures, and at some point it might become uninhabitable, even for humans. I would also say desertification, because it's impacting the agriculture, and Sudan is a country that depends mainly on agriculture when it comes to its economic. I think it's important to note that countries like Sudan cannot properly adapt to climate change, and they need help when it comes to this kind of stuff. One of the major impacts of climate change in Sudan is actually a conflict that occurred, which is called the Darfur conflict. Essentially, the whole thing started just because desertification impacted farmers and forced them to flee towards the south. The United Nations Environmental Programme published a post-conflict report where it described Darfur conflict as the first climate war. So I think if we don't take proper climate action, in the future we might see climate wars. The number of young Africans involved in the climate movement is actually increasing, and that's because people have started to finally become more aware of the issue. We're on the front line when it comes to climate change impacts, and we are one of the first continents threatened by climate change. So they're very aware of that fact, and they're using it as a motivation to keep going forward. One of the things that I use in my writings is that I speak to people directly. So I don't use complex language, for example, like I don't use scientific jargons or scientific sentences when I'm talking about climate change. I usually use very simple language. And I also try to relate it to their daily life. I also try to relate it to things that they believe in. One of my most successful articles were about climate change from an Islamic perspective. In Islam, one of the main concepts is that everything that happens is a plan from God, and we should not question it. We should be patient. I went through Quran and read more about it, and in Quran it actually says that God sent us to earth to protect it, and that we should try to preserve earth and not destroy it. I started explaining to people how climate change is actually the impacts of us destroying earth, and that we were not actually following what God told us, and we're actually doing the opposite. Climate change is different from each country to another, and even the climate debate is different. Each climate debate needs to be customized to fit with the culture of the country, the impacts and the challenges that face that country. The most recent conference that I went to on climate change was actually the Conference of the Parties, which was held in Madrid and in Spain. That conference was supposed to be one of the main conferences that decides on the future of climate policies, because countries were supposed to finally agree on a way to implement Paris Agreement. One of the main things that I noticed is that the process of the climate negotiations is actually very slow. Seeing how people negotiate in the room and how they fight over one word or one sentence was actually not a nice experience, I would say. And it made me really wonder if we're going to make it, really. Because if this is how countries negotiate and this is how much time they take over one text, then maybe we don't have enough time.
My name is François-Marie Bréon. I'm a climate scientist, so I work in a climate research center. My specialty is the use of satellite to study the current climate and to try to understand processes about the climate. Now with the satellite, we can measure the sea level rise in a way that is extremely accurate. And the sea level rise is a direct consequence of climate warming. Another thing that we can observe from satellite is the mass of ice caps in Greenland and in Antarctica. And now we have indisputable evidence that there is more and more ice that is melting from these ice caps. In France, we have had a few catastrophes that can be in some way related to climate change. We have had a very strong heat wave. 2003, we had a heat wave that killed about 15,000 people. And then very recently, we have some huge floods, which did not kill so many people, but had a large impact on the properties. The most obvious impact of climate change is the disappearance of glaciers in the mountains. And this is something that can be seen both on the ground, but also from space. I don't think that France is the most vulnerable country to climate change. It's a rather a rich country, but also because the current climate is moderate. Other countries will be most affected by climate change than France is. Even though the Paris Accord took place in France, it is definitely an international agreement. Most French people do think that the climate change is really an issue and there is a need to do something about it. Because of this large public awareness, maybe France would be able to lead the way for the contribution of nuclear power. 70% of our electricity is made through nuclear power, and that makes it possible for France to have a rather low carbon emission compared to other comparable countries such as Germany or Britain or the US. So one thing that we could do is to shut down all coal power plants. And that will not solve all of the problem, but that will make maybe 1/3 of the step forward. The other thing that can be done at the short term is to convince people that international flights have to stop in the next 10 or 20 years. Our grandparents did not use airplanes. We have to go back to that. This is also something that is affected very much the climate. The COVID-19 was interesting in the sense that a lot of things have been shut down during the lockdown, and the carbon emission of France decreased between 15 and 30% depending on the period you are considering. In a way, it's interesting to see that we can do something about carbon emission, but it's also frightening to see that even when you stop down many things, the decrease in carbon dioxide emissions are not that large. Right now, there is a debate in France whether the general public has a direct access to reliable information. And actually, the COVID crisis was a disaster in that respect because we have had all kinds of conspiracy theory at a level that has never been seen before.
Moi, je me pose une question justement sur le plan terroriste.
It's not possible to convince someone today that it has a personal interest to fight against climate change because the impact will not be that large for our own generation. There is a need to fight today against climate change because we do need to think about the next generation. Even if you were to shut down all coal power plants today, you will not see any impact on the climate within the next 10 years, for instance. And so this is really what makes the fight against climate change so difficult.
One of the things that Francois mentioned is that the generations that might be affected by climate change are not born yet. I agree with this, but I myself already experiencing climate change impacts in my daily life. And I do have family members whose houses were destroyed because of the floods. So I wouldn't say people are not impacted and that they shouldn't care because the impacts are already there in some parts of the world.
Actually, you are perfectly right. What I meant to say is that if we start fighting against climate change today, the impact will be seen in a long time from now. And so people will not see the benefit of their own behavior in their lifetime.
Well, I think Sudan and France have completely different battles to fight. France is in a way better position, and that's because they have more resources and better infrastructure to deal with the impacts. Any natural disaster that we get hit by sets us back more than we already are. So I think it really just shows how there's inequality when it comes to the fight against climate change.
Actually, this is what is so unfair about climate change. The ones that are the least responsible are actually the ones that are the most affected.
I think one of the mistakes that the media has currently fallen into is that they've used the wrong narrative when it comes to climate change. Titles would be like, we're doomed, our Earth is dying, and if we won't have a future. And I think that has caused people to be alarmed too much to the point that they feel like anything that they could do would not make a change. We need to shift from an alarming narrative to a solution-driven narrative. It's really a fight for all, and it's about justice. So even if you're not impacted, someone else is, and we need to fight together.
I do have a direct access to the science on climate change, and Lina has much more competences to convey this information to the public. And this is where we can work together.
That can be the bridge between the information that he has and the public.
I mean, I wish I was able to meet Lina in person, but that would unfortunately involve air travel, and I'm fighting very much against air travel.
I think for me, one more thing we could do for fun is that we could teach each other languages. I've always wanted to learn French, so you could teach me some climate terms in French, and I could teach you the equivalent of it in Arabic.